It's great to be joined today by Bill Oglesby, who's an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University's Robertson School of Media and Culture, also the producer and director of GerryRIGGED, Turning Democracy on Its Head, a documentary produced by community idea stations in cooperation with the public interest group One Virginia 2021, which is working on issues of redistricting. Bill, it's so great to have you on. Let's just start at the most basic point, which is when we talk about gerrymandering, what are we talking about?
Gerrymandering is very simply the drawing of political lines for a partisan purpose, usually by the very people who tend to benefit from those lines being drawn that way.
And when we're talking about elections, in a presidential election, gerrymandering is much less relevant than when we look at the makeup of the U.S. House of Representatives. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, of course, in presidential elections, we're dealing with generally a winner-take-all kind of situation in all but two states, where the person getting the most votes takes all of the electoral votes. Of course, that the electoral college is another issue. In Maine and Nebraska, they have it the votes distributed according to, as I understand it, the House of Representatives, the House congressional districts. That could be affected by gerrymandering because House districts are. The Senate, of course, the U.S. Senate, not so much either, because you have two U.S. senators and they're elected statewide, so there's no lines to be drawn. So gerrymandering is not an issue there. Where we find gerrymandering is really an issue are in the state legislatures and in the U.S. House of Representatives.
And in the documentary, Virginia is a big deal when it comes to gerrymandering. It was actually the Virginia governor, Patrick Henry, who was the first to sort of redistrict in his favor, even though the name gerrymandering is actually because of our former governor in Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. So talk a little bit about how this started, when it started, and then how it became something that's just so common today.
Yeah, well, of course, that's nice of you to bring that up because that's a big deal here in Virginia. Of
Yeah,
course, we're always sort of vying with Massachusetts a little bit for these
should be
things,
Henry
but
mandering,
but
really.
yes, exactly. Well, and the reason I think it was not called Henry Mandering was it didn't work for Patrick Henry. He tried it basically in 1788. What he was trying to do was he actually had a political feud sort of going on with future President James Madison. And so what he did was he redistricted so that James Madison's home would be in the same district with James Monroe, another future president, thinking that that would surely mean that James Madison would lose. Unfortunately for him, it didn't work, and James Madison won anyway. So that's probably why he didn't get quite as much notoriety from Henry Mandering as later Elbridge Gerry in Massachusetts, and I don't know why. I think his name was pronounced Gary, and it's gerrymandering usually. But this was in 1812, a few years later, and he drew a district that was said to resemble a salamander. It was so unusual with the lines being drawn, and that's how we came up with the term gerrymandering, was
So
through
explain
him.
the logistics of it a little bit. I think if you say to someone, well, you can draw the districts in a way that's advantageous for one party or another, it might not be completely self-evident the sort of mathematics and logistics of how that works.
Right. Well, basically, of course, the census is taken every 10 years, and the first year of the decade. So the next one will be, the last one was in 2010, the next one will be in 2020. The year after that, when we have all of the figures from the census, that's when lines are redrawn, because we need to have, as part of the one person, one vote system, we need to have districts that are approximately equal in population. So as the population changes every 10 years, you need to redraw those district lines. And it is generally the state legislature that's drawing those district lines. And so they're drawing it for themselves. They're also drawing it for the House of Representatives. So they can draw the lines in such a way that they benefit one particular party over another. And I do want to emphasize that both parties have been equally guilty of this when they've been in power. It just depends which one is in power at any given time. And we do see in the United States today where on a state by state basis, states where Republicans are stronger, they tend to be drawing the lines to benefit Republicans, and in states where Democrats are stronger, they draw them to benefit Democrats.
And one of
But
the
what's
so as an example, you could imagine a hypothetical state with 60% Democrats and 40% Republicans. And if that would sort of lead you to think that if you had a fair drawing of the districts, roughly 60% of the House seats would end up held by Democrats and 40% held by Republicans. Talk to us about how you can draw districts such that you would not end up with that ratio.
Well, it's actually what's made gerrymandering such a problem today as opposed to 200 years ago is that we have computer software that can do it in a remarkably efficient way. Literally, they can know, and of course, that gets down to all of the information that can be collected on people through marketing efforts and so forth on the internet. We can know what kinds of magazines people subscribe to. We can know all sorts of things that tell us this person is more likely a Democrat, this person is more likely a Republican. And these computer programs can literally draw lines around houses, down streets, ignoring blocks in such a way that they basically ensure that the person who represents that district is not going to have significant opposition from the other party. And that's not good for society. It leads to a case where, as it's been said many times, the politicians are choosing the voters rather than the voters choosing the politicians. And that is to a great extent happening because of this very sophisticated computer software that uses very sophisticated algorithms to do its job.
So in our imaginary 60% Democratic, 40% Republican state, you could take those 60% Democrats and cram them into some smaller percentage of the districts, which would still have in the popular vote, maybe for these House seats, 60% of the votes going to Democrats, but you would end up with far fewer than 60% of the seats held by Democrats. That's generally the idea, is it not?
Yes, and it gets a little more complicated because, if you think about it, the only way that you would end up with a perfect 60-40 split in the scenario you came up with is if those people were distributed pretty equally
Right.
in the geography of the state. But what happens is, and this is one of the arguments that's used against redistricting reform, is when you have certain urban areas, we're tending to live around like-minded people. So we tend to have urban areas where Democrats concentrate and rural areas where Republicans concentrate. Those rural areas are more spread out. So in a lot of those Democratic urban districts, you're not going to have a 60-40 Democratic split. You're going to have perhaps a 70-75% Democratic base. And so that's going to be fewer Democrats in other districts. So it doesn't create a perfect situation. Here in Virginia, we've had statewide Democratic officials elected consistently through this decade. We haven't had a Republican statewide official elected since 2009, and yet our House of Delegates is 2/3 Republican, 66 seats out of 100.
You alluded
That
to
should
you alluded to big data being able to tell us based on different characteristics that someone might have whether they're more likely to be a Democratic or Republican voter. One of these indicators, mathematically speaking, is also race. And courts have ruled that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. But how can you draw the line as to what constitutes definitive racial gerrymandering versus tying districts to some other characteristics that underlying that, certainly race may still persist? I mean, it seems like a very complex gray area, does it not?
Well, it is. And what they have to do is they have to try to measure intent, to look at what the intent of the legislature is. Because under the Voting Rights Act, we actually want to have some majority-minority districts so that we encourage the ability for minorities to be elected to Congress and so forth. But what happens is you're not supposed to be able to take the racial data in order to pack districts. We have a situation where what's happened is because there's a perception that the minority voters are more likely to be Democrat, what Republican legislatures are doing is they're packing as many minorities into that one Democratic majority minority district as possible, more than they need to. And what that does is that assures that the 3 or 4 districts that surround it are going to go Republican. So that's what happens in a packing situation. So the idea is that yes, under the Voting Rights Act, for a very laudable goal, you are supposed to take race into account to some extent, but it's not supposed to be your primary factor.
Let me remind you, we've been speaking with Bill Oglesby, who's an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, also the producer and director of the documentary Jerry-Rigged, Turning Democracy on Its Head. Let's pause there. We're going to pick it up tomorrow with Bill and talk about how bad is national gerrymandering at this point in the United States. Thanks so much, Bill.
Thank you, David.
Continuing with us on the program today is Bill Oglesby. He's an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University's Robertson School of Media and Culture, also the producer and director of the documentary film Jerry-Rigged, Turning Democracy on Its Head. Bill, yesterday we left off after talking about sort of figuring out what is gerrymandering, political redistricting, some of the strategies that are used. How can we measure how bad national gerrymandering is right now, and what sorts of data can we look at to inform ourselves about that?
Well, we know it's bad because what we have is the parties have gotten smart. Back in 2010, the Republican Party, which was reeling from the election of Barack Obama, and of course, initially had Democratic control of the Congress at that point. That means that the Democrats were in control of the agenda, and the Republicans were panicking to some extent. But you have to give them credit. What they did was they looked at a national map. They looked at every state, at districts across those states, and they very, very strategically targeted certain districts within each state that were vulnerable. And in those districts, they put a tremendous infusion of money. On a national basis, it ended up being not as expensive as it would sound for them. It was just that they were very strategic in the way they put the money into those districts. And it succeeded in turning over the state legislatures in large numbers of states to Republican control. And that meant the next year that the Republicans were in charge of the redistricting agenda. And that's why we have a situation now where we have so many non-competitive districts. As an example, a couple of years ago, with 435 members of the House of Representatives, only a handful of districts were competitive, and only, I think, 7 districts out of 435 were considered to be toss-ups. That's how well they've done with that.
Is there a mathematical analysis that can be done which would say that if we had fair districting, the odds that you would have only 7 toss-ups out of 435 seats are some, I would imagine, incredibly small number outside the possibility of just average chance? Does such data exist?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got to be able to, the same data that allows you to draw districts so that each and every, in most cases, district becomes uncompetitive or non-competitive. That same data can be used to make districts more compact, which will in many cases make them more competitive. Not in all cases, because you don't really want to substitute one form of gerrymandering for another. It's really not, the idea is normally not to try to make every district a competitive district. It's simply not to have the people who are in office controlling their own reelection and controlling the lack of competition they have. I think it's important to point out, because a lot of people don't really, understandably, don't really know what is caused by gerrymandering. But when you have this lack of competition, it leads to voter apathy, and that in turn leads to a lack of moderation. If I'm representing a certain district and I'm not worried about a challenge from the other party because they mathematically can't win in my district, what I am concerned about is a challenge from within my own party, which tends to take me further to the left if I'm a Democrat, further to the right if I'm a Republican. We've got data that shows that in cases where that has been removed as a factor, people tend to move more toward the middle. There's more moderation. But the situation we have now is leading to the kind of hyper partisanship and gridlock that we're all seeing on certainly the national level and in many cases the state level.
Not only that, I mean, we also know that when voter turnout is depressed, it tends to help the candidate that's further to the right. And this applies between Democrats and Republicans, but also within primaries. With the more conservative of the Democrats in a primary, the more conservative of the Republicans in a primary, and feeling like there's no point to voting because it's so non-competitive would only depress voter turnout further, as you're sort of pointing out. Is there a number you could give us, Bill? Like, for example, in order for Democrats to win 50% of House seats nationally, they would need to get X% of the total number of votes that might illuminate how skewed the situation is?
Yeah, I don't have that exact number, but you're right. It would take more than 50 because it would, we do have a situation again where um, you do have living patterns such that you can't, even if you have compact contiguous districts, which is what is required in most states, and certainly would lead to greater communities of interest, which is what we're ultimately striving for. But because of voting patterns or living patterns, rather, it's not a perfect system.
Sure.
So you do have to allow for that. I think in Virginia, for instance, even though we are statewide, Democrats appear to be at an advantage. If we had that perfect system where we removed gerrymandering as a factor, we would probably still have Republican control in our House of Delegates, for instance. It would probably be 55 out of 100 rather than 66 out of 100, though.
Major difference, no doubt about it, when you're talking about breaking gridlock and passing bills. Let's talk a little bit about other ways that this could be done. California passed Proposition 11, which put issues of redistricting into the hands of a nonpartisan commission back in 2008. Is that a good strategy? What other strategies exist? And how can the average voter get involved in this?
Right. Many states are looking at independent redistricting commissions, and I think that's important. Now, they take many different forms. In California, they have a system where virtually anybody can apply to be on that commission. California has a strong, as many Western states do, a very strong kind of voter initiative kind of system, and that probably led, since that's how Proposition 11 was passed, that led to them being the leader in this. Also, another thing they have out in California that's worth mentioning that would be very, very difficult in a state that doesn't have voter initiative is they have their top two finisher primaries, where instead of having a separate Republican and Democratic primary, you have one primary, everybody runs in that primary, and the top two finishers go on to meet in the general election. Sometimes those top two finishers are going to both be Democrats, sometimes they're going to both be Republicans, but they're both going to have to appeal to the middle, or the successful one is going to be the one that tends to appeal to the middle. So that's what has had a big effect in moderating out there. In other states, in Virginia, the one we're talking about, the system we're talking about right now, would be where you would have a commission with a couple of Democrats, a couple of Republicans, but there would also be three members that would be nonpartisan state officials, sort of like the executive director of the Virginia State Bar, who's not considered to be a Republican or a Democrat. Doesn't mean they don't have opinions, obviously, but they are used to playing nonpartisan roles. And the idea also being that whatever plan they put forward, that they come up with and put forward, has to have a super majority. So if we had that kind of commission and both Republicans or both Democrats opposed the plan that was put forward, it could not go forward. It would have to have at least bipartisan support.
So, Bill, we're
so
a couple years out now from the census, and then after that, we will have the redistricting. At what point and in what ways can individuals who care about this issue get involved, be it with the census or with the actual districting process in their state, to have an impact here?
Good question. The thing that we're finding that, of course, is really important is for people to care enough to call their representatives and their senators as well, because the state senate, even though the state senate is subject to this as well, they let them know that you care. They tend to realize that the issues that people are most likely to call them about are ones that involve their taxes or involve their children's or their children or their schools. They don't think people care about redistricting, but as people come to understand just the damaging effects that are happening because of redistricting in a gerrymandered way, people are getting involved, they're calling their representatives, and they need to do that. So it becomes an issue, and it really is a good government issue. Even in Virginia, former Governor and Senator George Allen, a Republican who was a victim of gerrymandering when he was in the U.S. House at the hands of a Democratic state legislature, he has called it ridiculous and said reform is needed. So that's what people need to do, is let their representatives know. It's being attacked on a number of fronts. It's being attacked in the legislatures. Gerrymandering is being attacked through, in some cases, voter initiative when that's available. In the courts, we have significant cases that are coming. One that's coming up very soon before the Supreme Court that could have a fact or an effect across the board, across the United States, in how these districts are drawn and as a result, who gets elected.
The documentary
So the big
is
thing is
Jerry-Rigged, Turning Democracy on Its Head. We've been speaking with the film's producer and director, Bill Oglesby, who's also an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University's Robertson School of Media and Culture. Bill, super interesting, important, and an issue we're going to be staying on. So thank you so much for talking to us about it.
I appreciate you doing that, David. Thank you. It's been good talking with you.